recession and so on. Throughout capitalism's history, that's been the norm, with exceptions, of course. Post-World War II, the boom lasted for a good part of 3 decades. Now, the reason for its longevity was the introduction into the production process of continuous flow production machines, which are semi-automatically operated by electronic apparatus, or semi-automatic production. It took until the 1970s before this new type of production had been spread throughout the world and became the norm. Because the new machines were relatively efficient compared to pre-war technology, capitalists investing in them could expect an increased rate of profit. This dynamic was the motor of the 3-decade boom until semi-automated production became generalised by the 1970s, meaning capitalist firms who invested in it then, invested in further expanding their productive capacity then, could no longer expect to increase their profits by doing so. And obviously, if a capitalist can't increase their profits by investing, well, then they're not going to invest, and they didn't. And that was the cause of economic crisis in the 1970s. In 1974-5, after a period of rapid inflation, the world economy entered a recession. The recession, when it ended, did not restore the profitability of the long post-war boom, and world capitalism entered a period of much slower growth, marked by rising unemployment and inflation, a phenomenon dubbed stagflation. Keynesian measures, then the orthodox economic policy of all the main capitalist governments, which were government spending to boost the economy, proved to be of no avail. In fact, they only worsened the situation by increasing the rate of inflation. Companies failed to respond to increases in demand by boosting production, as Keynesian theory suggested they should, but companies instead sought to lift their depressed profit rates by increasing prices while looking at the same time to cutting their workforce, which was a virtual recipe for working class militancy, which is in fact what happened. You can imagine that constant high inflation demands that the working class be involved in industrial struggle against their bosses to keep their real wages, so they have to constantly have an increase in wages. Eventually, the US ruling class attempted to restore profitability, starting with what became known as the Volcker shock, which Laura referred to. The Federal Reserve, under then Chairman Paul Volcker, massively raised interest rates, making it even more expensive for companies to invest. This led to the 1981-82 Global Recession, where US unemployment rose to 11%, and neoliberal austerity measures began before the recession, but were then increased throughout the 80s. Post the recession of 81-2, again there was no return to the conditions of post-war boom. However, this time the capitalists began to accumulate capital or make profit in another way. Neoliberal policies shifted the social surplus created by the working class from going into wages for workers onto profits, changed it to sort of redirecting it into profits. They did this through progressive reductions in real wages and by cutting social services. Privatisation opened up new areas for profitable investment. Neoliberal policies also included deregulation of the financial sector, which legally facilitated the shift of investment dollars from productive capital to parasitic capital, that is the finance sector. That necessitated, this process was necessitated by declining profitability, and this is what's been referred to as the financialisation of the economy, which is the relative increased importance of the finance sector compared with the size or the weight of the productive sector. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the Eastern Bloc opened up new markets and cheap labour from which international capitalism had previously been excluded. In 1989, the Chinese Communist Party ordered the massacre of students and workers demonstrating in Tiananmen Square for democratic socialism and against the pro-capitalist policies then already being implemented by the Communist Party of China under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. The defeat of that popular movement opened the way for open and accelerated capitalist restoration in China, progressively bringing some 1 billion people into the world market and offering the labour power of hundreds of millions of Chinese workers onto the world market for around 1/30th of a US wage. These factors underwrote continued accumulation of capital for the last 25 to 30 years, both these political developments in the form of socialist economies, as well as the austerity programs and neoliberal programs. However, the actual accumulation of profit has not always occurred directly. An example of this, in a recent speech hailing the virtues of globalisation, European Commissioner Peter Mandelson, I don't know if he still is, noted that a Chinese manufacturing firm producing an iPod receives only $4 US for a device that retails for $290 in the US. Mandelson was pointing to a process in which surplus value extracted in China is then distributed into other sections of capital in the form of license fees, rents, and interest to banks and financial institutions, etc. This is in part an example of financialisation. Apart from the freight, storage, research and development, etc. Now, if we're talking about iPods, I mean, it doesn't cost much to freight them or store them, really. The rest of that $290 US retail is taken by various parasitical branches of capital. Globally, i.e. they didn't produce anything, they just were able to appropriate. Globally, the ratio of parasitic capital to productive capital has altered greatly in favour of the parasites since the end of the long boom. But as is clearly demonstrated in this example, their profits are actually created by, in this case, the mostly Chinese workers who actually make something. Okay, so yeah, there's just a few statistics on well, the financialisation of the economy and of course the growth of parasitic capital. Now, of course, all capitalists are parasites and extracting labour from workers, but some of them are more parasitical than others. I mean, yeah, it sort of sounds funny, but that's the sort of most accurate term you can really use, because they're not only extracting value that is from workers' labours, but they're actually taking it from other capitalists who have organised the workers to make it, so they really don't do anything at all. So yeah, in the early 1980s, the financial sector accounted for about 10% of total profits. By 2007, they were 40% of profits. From the 50s to the 70s, financial assets to GDP, so that is the amount that an economy produces in a year, or the world economy in this case. Financial assets were 4 to 1. By 2007, it was 10 to 1. In 1980, world financial assets amounted to 119% of annual global production. 2007, 356%. So, I mean, obviously increased in importance, yeah, particularly since the start of neoliberalism in the early 80s. Now, for many liberals and social democrats, this is the whole problem. They think that the state should simply regulate business activity, therefore forcing capitalists to make productive investment, which sounds logical enough. Well, firstly, I mean, the most basic point is you can't stop capitalists speculating so long as they're still in control of society's means of production, even in the most heavily regulated environment. And you take even Venezuela, for example, where the state is totally against the capitalist control of the economy, but in the sections that they do still control, like food production, or most of it in Venezuela, they're able to hoard food and get the price to go up and speculate. Like, if they control any crucial commodity, whether it's food, oil, anything you actually need, then they can make the price of that go absolutely through the roof by, you know, withdrawing it from the market. It's one form of speculation. Even in Cuba, I mean, Fidel called them making an attack on the Republic, was his reference to really small farmers, like when they introduced or reintroduced some more private farming after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. So you had, you know, these tiny private enterprises who controlled a bit of food, and they would hoard it and speculate and send the price, you know, and sort of divert